Hello, everybody. Welcome to Butler College. I'm Shelley Hazer. I'm the director of the Lifelong Learning Program here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and welcoming new people here. So welcome, and it's great to see you. So tonight, we've had a spectacular lifelong learning session, and tonight's our last event that closes out our spring, not only our speaker series with the St. Augustine Historical Society, but also the lifelong learning spring session. And we knew it was going to be a really full crowd. It's a great speaker, Dr. Butler, and fantastic topics. So before I hand it over to Megan Altus at the St. Augustine Historical Society, I just wanted to point out that Dr. Butler is teaching a class this summer. If you're interested, it's Elvis of the South, American History. So there was a flyer out front. He's also involved in lifelong learning, and we're very grateful that he lends his talent to the program. So without any more discussion, I'm going to hand it over so Megan can introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Just a reminder to everyone, May 15th, the St. Augustine Historical Society will be honoring the Sisters of St. Joseph with the Herschel Shepherd Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation. And that's at the Oldest House Museum Complex. It's free and open to the public, 5:30 on May 15th. So if you can join us, please do. But tonight, we have Dr. Butler. Dr. J. Michael Butler is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College, where he has taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading, peer-reviewed academic publications, such as American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, Southern Cultures, and most recently, the Journal of African American History. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler received his PhD in history from the University of Mississippi, specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the Black freedom struggle, and has spoken to dozens of teachers and community groups about the civil rights movement and African American history. His work has been featured by PBS, NPR, C-SPAN, NBC Newsroom, or News.com, Salon.com, and Vanity Fair magazine. This fall, Dr. Butler will be a scholar in residence at Yale University, where he will continue working on his latest book, A History of the St. Augustine Confederate Line. A warm welcome to Dr. J. Michael Butler.
Number one, it's always a pleasure to speak at a place that hands out drinks before the lecture, right? So I appreciate the tailgating aspect, and my students finally have, or former students, I should say, finally have a reason to drink while I talk. Second thing, the bio is really flattering. Thank you for indulging that. The cashiers at Publix get really tired when I read that out to them. So, you know, it's maybe more appropriate today to have that sort of establish some sort of credibility. One of the difficulties in talking about local history to local people in the place where it happened is keeping it fresh, keeping it new. You've heard many of these stories before. Some of you have heard some of these stories from me before. The focus tonight, though, is the arrest of the 16 rabbis and one cleric, so it was 17 in total in St. Augustine, what led to it, why it matters, and most importantly, why it's still relevant. Some of the stories will be familiar, and some of the stories we are going to go through relatively rapidly. But tonight what I want to do is build to the letter that was written, which Andrew Young called the Jewish letter from Birmingham jail, why we win. So to establish the importance of the history that we are familiar with and that we appreciate, let's talk about St. Augustine 1964. Why is this topic important? What is the answer to the so what question right off the top? Something that my students are familiar with me throwing at them all the time. So what? St. Augustine is a microcosm into many more complexities of the civil rights movement at the national level. Some things that we can take away from St. Augustine, big picture, is that number one, it stretches the timeline that we usually associate with the civil rights movement. It's called the master narrative, right? It's from 1954 to 1968. Roughly Brown versus Board to the assassination of Dr. King. One of the things that we can learn about the civil rights movement, big picture from St. Augustine, is that the struggle for racial equality began well before 1945 in this community, and it continued well beyond 1968 in this community. That's true for the nation as a whole. So you see patterns, you see rhythms, you see trends that exist in St. Augustine that can illuminate what the Black freedom struggle looks like on a national level. So the timeline is expanded. The emphasis of local people. We often think that the civil rights movement began when W.B. Du Bois started the NAACP or Dr. King is sent from above, frees all the black folks, sits on the back of the front of the bus, is elected president, and we all live happily ever after, right? And that's not the way it happened. If not for local people, if not for the Dr. Robert Halings, if not for the Henry and Catherine Twines, if not for the Barbara Vickers, if not for the Maud Jacksons, the people that I've had an opportunity to talk to, we don't have a movement that attracts national attention. In other worwords, SCLC and NAACP only goes places where they are asked to intervene. And they're asked to intervene because of local struggles by people just like the ones that are sitting in this room. So it reorientates the movement from a top-down, great man, great organization history to, no, this is a bottom-up foot soldiers movement that's made up of people who live, worship, and eat among us. Local people. Reorientates the movement. The role of organizations. The role of nonviolence. We always think that because Dr. King is sort of the personification of the movement, that nonviolence is the norm. Even with people who join SCLC and even with those who join NAACP. The other thing we can learn is that different organizations had different strategies. They had a different focus. The NAACP, and we see it here, it's more legalistic. It's more top-down. It's more legislation. It's less on direct action. Because, as one movement veteran said, that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. Right? For SCLC, it is nonviolent. It is Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But not everyone who joined the SCLC believed in the principle of nonviolence. Dr. Haling told me himself that when he was kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan, he had a .357 Magnum in his glove compartment. So the role of organizations becomes more complex, and the approaches that they use are more complex by looking at it at the local level. And most importantly, national importance. What happened in St. Augustine was important, first and foremost, for the people of St. Augustine whose legacies we're still living with today. But it's also important on the national level because what happens locally both reflects and influences events that happens on a much broader scale. And nowhere is more clear in that relationship than St. Augustine in the spring of 1964 for reasons that I'm going to discuss as we go. So I often say that the difference between the professional historian and the amateur historian is that the professional has an obligation to provide context. Why does it matter? What else is going on? Let's put St. Augustine 1963 because this is when activities that have national importance begin to transpire in the ancient city. Let's put it into context of what else is going on nationally in terms of the topic. And to understand that, you have to look at Birmingham, Alabama. Great book, one of my favorites, Local Histories, but for Birmingham, that examines the role of Birmingham both locally and in the national movement. And long story short, Birmingham, spring of 1963, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Southern Christian Leadership Conference is reeling, right? Dr. King's organization. He's invited by Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a Baptist minister, who, by the way, is arrested in St. Augustine with the rabbis. Okay? Minister in Birmingham, he invites SCLC to come help integrate the city. What transpires in Birmingham is that Project C for confrontation really goes into effect. And what Project C means is that direct action nonviolence was meant to spark a violent backlash. That law enforcement, that advocates of law and order would overreact and use violence that often was not captured by cameras or news agencies, broadcasted throughout the world. Project C would create a public backlash, and that public backlash would make it all the way to Washington, D.C. Now, what Dr. King learned and what SCLC learned and what Fred Shuttlesworth learned in Birmingham was that one of the demands that John F. Kennedy faced as president was to do something about what he later called the great moral crisis of our time, and that was the struggle for racial equality. The outcome was, instead of demanding that local communities integrate Montgomery, Birmingham, Atlanta, Charlotte, on a case-by-case basis, that one piece of federal legislation is passed that would kill Jim Crow with the stroke of a pen, the Civil Rights Act. The first piece of civil rights legislation passed at the federal level since Reconstruction ended. We don't know exactly when, but SCLC begins to focus all of its attention on magnifying Project C, of getting national attention on this national struggle with the end game of having the president present a Civil Rights Act to Congress. That's why we get the images that we do of Dr. King being arrested and writing in a response to ministers who called his involvement unwise and untimely. I said they basically preacher shamed him. Let us work things out on a local level. Be patient. You're an outsider. And oh, by the way, you call yourself a minister. King's response was a letter from Birmingham jail. The single greatest defense and explanation of nonviolent direct action the movement produced. That got national attention. Then the images that came from the children's campaign and the need for reinforcements and the overreaction of Bull Connor and the Birmingham Fire Department and the use of trained K-9 units against nonviolent peaceful protesters. A photograph that John F. Kennedy said made him physically ill when he first saw it. You see the images of the fire department pointing their hoses 350 pounds per square inch of pressure against nonviolent demonstrators. You see children literally being loaded into school buses and taken to jail. It riled the moral consciousness of the country, and Project C worked. June 18, 1963, John F. Kennedy goes on television in a press conference and promises that he's going to deliver a Civil Rights Act to Congress. That night, Medgar Evers, NAACP Field Secretary of Mississippi, is shot down in his own driveway. That's going to have an impact in St. Augustine, too. However, no guarantee that Kennedy was actually going to follow through on his promise. I've never known a Kennedy to, not follow through on their promises or. Wait. And so anyway, I was just thinking I need to get vaccinated. Glad you got that. The idea was as well to demonstrate to the president that this was just not a Southern black issue. That civil rights and support for this legislation would actually draw support from interfaith organizations, from other religious leaders, from people who lived in cities, in places like Detroit, labor unions, rabbis, members of the Jewish community. That this could be an interfaith national movement that would demonstrate to Kennedy that, yes, you're going to have a hard time fighting for this bill in your own party because Southern Democrats were going to fight it to the bitter end, and they do. but you're going to gain all of this other support that you don't know you have. The plan then was for the 5 largest civil rights organizations and every major religious group in the country to form consensus and plan basically what was a pep rally for the Civil Rights Act that was called the March on Washington Movement for Jobs and Freedom. Yeah, the image, this is one of my favorite images from Birmingham 63 that illustrates the damage that fire hoses could do in a public park, right? You literally have people being given concussions with the pressure as it hit them or threw them into buildings or into trees. But the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. You will hear different accounts about how big or how small it was. We really don't know because there wasn't a turnstile, right? But the generous estimate is anywhere between 150 and 250,000 people, okay? It came together and it remains the largest civil rights demonstration in American history prior to the summer of 2020. It was a celebration. Every major organization that participated had a speaker. Entertainers performed. Bob Dylan actually performed on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before Dr. King spoke. But the final speech that was given before Dr. King spoke was given by a rabbi, president of the American Jewish Congress. His name was Joachim Prinz. A Reform Jewish rabbi, president of the American Jewish Congress. Again, reiterating this bond between religious organizations that existed outside of the South and the freedom struggle that was emanating from the South. It was the first and last time that all 5 major civil rights organizations in this country worked together on one campaign. So it did demonstrate to Kennedy and to the nation that the Civil Rights Act had widespread popular support throughout the nation. And that's why St. Augustine became what a Florida investigative committee called a segregated time bomb that would explode at any moment. One of the things that I want to reiterate before we even dive into that aspect is the association between Jewish organizations and the Civil Rights Movement. Okay? This is not something that started in 1963, and it's not something that ended after the March on Washington or even ended in the 1960s. One of the things that Dr. King noticed was that there was a shared belief in social justice, particularly between the Jewish reformist tradition and the Black evangelical tradition. Now, I'm going to talk about why as we get into the letter, because there are specific reasons why that the Reform, the Black Christian emphasis on social justice and racial equality were mutually supportive. I'm going to save that for the letter. But we can go all the way back to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and understand that synagogues were one of the first white-owned places that opened their doors to Black congregations to organize. And because these synagogues opened their doors for Black organizations to meet and organize, they became targets for white violence. We see 1951, a rash of bombings against Jewish synagogues in Miami, Florida. We see in 1958, I think the number is 17 synagogues throughout the South are targeted, including the Atlanta synagogue. That's Mayor Hartsfield, whom the airport is named after in the picture of the ruins. Beyond that organizing tradition and mutual support, emphasis on social justice, Christian brotherhood, Jewish brotherhood, we have half of the people arrested as a result of the Freedom Rides in 1961 were Jewish. Half. The call was made in Birmingham for reinforcements to come and finish the Freedom Rides. Jewish congregations responded. Jewish students responded. We have Tallahassee, Florida. Israel Sy Dresner arrested with other ministers of different faiths for participating in the Tallahassee, Florida bus boycott. This, by all accounts, the accounts that I've read about Rabbi Dresner, is where his social consciousness was really awakened. So he became a very active participant in the movement and first met Dr. King when he was imprisoned in Albany, Georgia in 1962. Okay? So they knew each other. Rabbi Dresner was invited to the March on Washington and came, invited by Dr. King himself. This is going to be important for later. We have the infamous Mississippi burning case of 1964, actually where a lot of the reporters that were in St. Augustine, where they go after the Civil Rights Act is signed, is to the Mississippi Delta. For me, that's one of my kind of pet theories. One of the questions I often get is, why did the national media lose focus on St. Augustine after the Civil Rights Act was signed? It's because a lot of the media that were here were sent to the Mississippi Delta because it was Freedom Summer. And we know that as a part of Freedom Summer, many college campuses and many Jewish theological institutes were training their students to be volunteers to register African Americans to vote. And that led to the disappearance of James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. Later, all three found dead, murdered. This is the infamous Mississippi burning case. So, the Jewish African American relationship in this common struggle is something that stretches back to the post-World War II era, even before. If you look at the foundation of the NAACP, one of the founding members was a Jewish rabbi, all the way through the movement itself. So this is not surprising. It's always there. It's not something, though, that's often stressed in many of our civil rights courses or many of our civil rights topics. So in St. Augustine, in 1963-64, this was actually the title of a Harper's Magazine article that was written about St. Augustine. And the title was Anarchy in St. Augustine. I'll go ahead and give you one of the facts that has stayed with me that I learned from Andrew Young. I'll pick up that name that I just dropped later. But Andrew Young told me that SCLC is the only campaign, St. Augustine is the only SCLC campaign where medical expenses exceeded legal costs. When Dr. King wrote to the rabbis from the St. Johns County prison here, he told the rabbis that St. Augustine is worse than any city that we've ever visited. It's worse than Birmingham. So, St. Augustine becomes ground zero, particularly for violent white resistance. There is another lecture that I've given. I think it actually started this series about the movement in St. Augustine, where I go into that and why. And Dr. Robert B. Halen, who's on the screen here. It's a name you should know. He's one of the local heroes. One of the local heroes of the local movement. Organized the NAACP Youth Council. Was the person that the St. Augustine Four refused to sell out. And they go to adult institutions. He's the one that becomes public enemy number one for the mayor, chief of police, county sheriff. He's an outside agitator. All the tropes. He's uppity. He's arrogant. All of the things that people who are willing to put their lives on the line to achieve for others are called during this era. Okay? The FBI took great interest in what was going on in St. Augustine and documented almost daily, demonstrations that were beginning to grow. And there's a reason for it, and I can talk about that in the Q&A if you would like. But Dr. Haling is misquoted in the aftermath of Medgar Evers' assassination that we will shoot first and ask questions later. That gets the attention of segregationists from across the country, actually. The Connie Lynches from California, the J.B. Stoners from Georgia, the local auxiliary of the Klan, which was Catholic in nature, the Ancient City Gun Club, right? St. Augustine became the place where white people were going to stand up against passage of the Civil Rights Act. St. Augustine would be where they made an example of the movement goals and ambitions. And Haling would be the person that paid the price. The Klan, the National States' Rights Party, the Gun Club, acting in collaboration with local law enforcement, by the way, claimed the plaza as their territory, particularly the slave market. So that became the place where demonstrators target to demonstrate that they were not going to be intimidated, that they were not going to be made to fear for their lives, they were not going to back down. We have Klan rallies being advertised in the St. Augustine Record. Dr. Haling, it's an incredible story. It's one of those you can't make this up episodes from history where Dr. Haling and 3 members of the NAACP Youth Council decided, after his car was blanketed with advertisements for the Klan rally, decided to actually go. Right? And the stories that have been written are he was kidnapped, he made a wrong turn, or he went there of his own volition, and actually it was all 3. Right? He wanted to go to see who was there. How many local people are actually going to show up? And it was many more than the men anticipated. They went down a back road so that they could have a view of where the cross burning was happening. 2 men with shotguns approached the car. Dr. Haling tried to back away, got stuck, and they were literally walked to the front of the Klan rally as it was ending. And yeah, one of the men said that he will never forget that the face of true hate was on the women who were in the crowd and were demanding that their men castrate the N-word bastards. So they're beaten unconscious, basically tortured, and Dr. Haling said that the last thing he heard before he lost conscious was Connie Lynch asked, how many of you have had the pleasure of smelling an N-word burn? An informant was in the crowd, a minister from Daytona, called the FBI headquarters in Jacksonville, who called the sheriff and said this has to put a stop to this, and conveniently, the sheriff happened to be on site. So they arrested Dr. Haling and his 3 comrades for inciting a riot and assault. The NAACP basically distanced themselves from Haling and said no more demonstrations. We're not going to authorize you to organize our young people anymore. This is happening over a time, and again, I am going fast. I'm leaving out a lot of important details, but for the sake of the topic at hand, this is why. Got to give you the context. St. Augustine, as Dr. Haling said, was lawless. Dr. Haling, as 63 turned to 64, is a man without an organization. What does that mean for the future of the struggle here? One of the things it means nationally is that the future of the Civil Rights Act is unknown. Because John F. Kennedy is assassinated. The new president, a Texan, Lyndon Johnson, is he going to follow through on Kennedy's promise? He does, but again, one of the things that's hard about teaching history is that we know how the stories end. The people that we're teaching about don't. So you put yourself in their shoes, how's this going to go? In March of 64, really, after violence was becoming a common occurrence in the streets of Lincolnville, where homes are being shot into, where the movement is succumbing to intimidation and economic coercion, harassment. Dr. Haling and a group from St. Augustine went to Orlando, where the SCLC was having their annual convention, and asked for help. The SCLC, Dr. King's organization, said, we will send Hosea Williams, one of his lieutenants. We will send Hosea Williams in to sort of get the feel of the community, get the lay of the land, perhaps organize a boycott, demonstrations. We'll give it the SCLC seal of approval. But remember that the organization's primary goal in March of 1964 is to make sure that nothing sabotages the Civil Rights Act. That's the prize. We will organize St. Augustine because we're asked. That's the SCLC motto. But if it gets too hot, we've got too much to lose. So one of the things that was determined was an Easter 1964 selective buying campaign in St. Augustine. This was the pamphlet that SCLC put together to deter northern visitors, tourists, from coming to St. Augustine to celebrate the quadricentennial. Stay away from St. Augustine, 400 years of bigotry and hate, with the picture of Dr. Haling recovering from a number of broken fingers and broken wrists. And you can see it below. It says supported and maintained by Northern tourist dollars. So you know what the goal is. You know what is eventually going to come. Now, where St. Augustine goes to, an international story, is one of the things that happens is that the organization calls the Boston diocese and asks for Episcopalian assistance, because this is how SCLC worked, interfaith. Common in Boston for this diocese in particular to send volunteers to the South to help in selective buying campaigns and protests. But the head of the diocese wasn't in the office when the call went in from Hosea Williams, but Mrs. Mary Peabody was. The mother of the governor of Massachusetts. In talking to her son about this decision, she made the decision that it was her time to sacrifice. That it was her friend that she had to bear witness for. Came to St. Augustine, and of course, this is Mrs. Peabody. They don't like the way I say their last name. You know, Alabama, Massachusetts, the accent's a little different. So they say, no, Dr. Butler, it's not Peabody. It's Peabody there, but it's Peabody. So you see L.O. Davis reading the law to Mary Peabody. You have Dr. Haling looking like he's had enough, right? Because he had. It makes international news, right? I've seen from the family clippings from newspapers in Hungary and Italy of Governor of Massachusetts' mother arrested for violating segregation ordinance in St. Augustine, Florida. She's on the Today Show. Now, all of a sudden, St. Augustine, for a variety of reasons, but St. Augustine is on the international map. St. Augustine is becoming associated with what needed to change with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which, by the way, has been introduced to the Senate and is starting to make a long, onerous journey through the Senate. Here's Hosea Williams holding up the newspaper that says Mrs. Peabody arrested, and he is excited. This is the turning point. This is where St. Augustine is going to make a difference. There's a lot here that I'm going to summarize. And for me, one of the most important things is that when Andrew Young, who was another one of Dr. King's lieutenants, came to St. Augustine, Andrew Young basically told King, it's too dangerous. The streets are too dark. The possibility for snipers in the buildings around the plaza are too numerous. The white supremacists are too violent and too lawless. Something bad's going to happen. Dr. King wanted to pull the plug on SELC in St. Augustine. But because of people like Dr. Haling and Hosea Williams and Andrew Young eventually determining, after he's beaten unconscious for the first and only time in his life, that actually no, it's the opposite. St. Augustine is where we had to make our stand. And from May to early June of 1964, Dr. King makes a handful of visits to St. Augustine. And that's where we get the term from St. Augustine is going to be a place that would actually compromise the civil rights movement, because if violence breaks out here, somebody dies. The Southern Democrats are going to say, see, that's going to happen in the rest of the nation if we pass this act. The turn was, St. Augustine was what we had to show the rest of the nation we're trying to change with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. That's why it goes from a local story to one of national and international importance. This is why activism, not remaining silent, matters. They don't know how the story is going to end. Neither do we. So we have the press conferences. We have the demonstrations, and Virgil Stewart here, the chief of police, actually reading the signs one by one. Yes, an act of intimidation. You have Dr. King on the front porch of Dr. Haling's office. We've got the infamous photograph of Dr. King. You see this in textbooks as well, of pointing out the bullet hole in the cottage on St. Augustine Beach where he was staying that night. And of course, the footage of Andrew Young being beaten, recorded by Florida State Highway Patrol for training purposes, but they don't intervene to stop it. The arrest then that occurred downtown was planned, and it was supposed to have the same impact on the Civil Rights Act in '64 that it had with the writing of the letter from Birmingham Jail in 1963. It's the same pattern. It occurred at the Monson Motor Lodge for a variety of very strategic and purposeful reasons. Dr. King, on June 11, asked to enter the cafe to sit at the lunch counter. Of course, he's denied. This was when he said, I'm not leaving. You're going to have to arrest me. And that's what happens. That is when Dr. King is placed in our local jail. That is when, this should be very familiar to you guys, where Dr. King's fingerprints are taken. And Mr. and Ms. Phillips, if y'all haven't gone to the Lincolnville Museum, do yourself a favor and go. But she always points out, and I appreciate it, that there had been so many arrests in St. Augustine that the local police department had to borrow fingerprint cards from Palatka. And you can see it scratched out, Palatka, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida. Police department. This is where, literally, from a St. Johns County jail cell, that Dr. King writes a letter, a call for reinforcements, to his friend, Rabbi Cy Dresner. It was a short letter. It was curt. It asked for a task force of about 30 rabbis that would do much to buttress our efforts here and across the nation. He called St. Augustine, this is where he said St. Augustine was, quote, the most lawless community in which we have ever worked. The Civil Rights Act was mired in what became the longest filibuster of one bill in U.S. Senate history. stuck. Southern Democrats were determined to not let this bill go up for vote. That's why this is important. Rabbi Dresner gets the letter a few days later, June 16th, and actually reads it at a conference, the Central Conference of the American Rabbis meeting. The next day, 16 rabbis and one member of the laity, not knowing what to bring, what to pack, they only brought a toothbrush, left for St. Augustine. When they arrived on the 17th, I've listened to several of the rabbis who were here. One, Gerald Goldstein, said that first thing they did was ride around the plaza, and it was, quote, the most frightening experience of my life. A ride around to see all of the people who were in the plaza, listen to what they were saying. That night, the rabbis participated in a march to the plaza. And one of the things that you'll be familiar with as you learn this history is that the saying in the South was the only thing worse than an N-word was an N-word lover. The phrase that was used over and over to refer to these men were you white N-word rabbis. Okay? So you can imagine, they're seen as race traitors. They're seen as communists. That's one of the accusations that's from people of the Jewish faith. Right? The next day, as the vote was scheduled, and the filibuster is coming to an end. This is the relationship between the local and the national, because King and SCLC knows that the filibuster is reaching an end. Any day now, there's going to be cloture. There's going to be a vote. So what we need to do is have one major demonstration that somehow, like Birmingham, attracts national news and pushes the ball across the goal line. My words, not his. What that event was became the incident on June 18th at Monson Motor Lodge. It was around noon. Several African American demonstrators, including Fred Shuttlesworth, and the 16 rabbis and the one person that they had with them, decided that they would stage a pray-in. And when they all kneel to pray, and it's Rabbi Dresner who's leading the prayer, the proprietor of Monson Motor Lodge, Jimmy Bright, began arresting them one by one. That was kind of a diversion. Because what happened next, and here are the two pictures that come from the arrest of the rabbis, right? When they were arrested, they in unison began chanting the 23rd Psalm. Okay? Now, as they were being arrested, splash in the pool. An SCLC member by the name of Al Lingo had registered as a guest, was told he could invite guests to swim with him. So he invited a group of young Africans and J.T. Johnson, who was a lifeguard, right, to join them. Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy were across the street. They didn't know what would happen, but they knew to let the press know to be ready. We want to capture the arrest of the rabbis at the very least. That's why the media was there. Because what this becomes is the largest mass arrest of Jewish rabbis in American history. But instead,
That's what it was.
the photograph that's on the front page of Washington newspapers the next morning was of the owner pouring muriatic acid into the pool. I have a colleague that I work with Florida, well, it's Florida Council of History Education. Her husband is from Italy, and he said, that was in our textbooks in Italy. That when they got to the American Civil Rights Movement section, this was in Italian textbooks as the image of racial hatred in America, 2 miles from here, if that. Local actions have national and even international consequences. The rabbis who were incarcerated, first, their experiences were the experiences that black folk in St. Augustine had experienced the whole time. They were put in open air. They're called chicken coops, but basically open air prisons in the June sun with no shelter because the jails were full. They were allowed in the next day. They were allowed in that night at dusk. They decided that they would go on hunger strike. I don't know if that was I don't know why they made that decision. It's probably because the only food that they had was Gerber baby food. They were given, that was all that they were given, right? So they decided, no, we'll just go on hunger strike instead. They really decided that night, after being put in a 15 by 20 foot cell that was meant for 6 people. 19 people were in one cell. 15 by 20, 19 people. What they decided was that they had to write down the reasons that they decided to do what they did. Why? Because of the white savior complex. You don't want to be accused of coming down and helping the poor black people in the South who can't help themselves. You don't want to be the white savior who comes in, is arrested, and then leaves town. You want to be able to articulate the reasons why this struggle matters and matters to them. Each rabbi was given a sheet of paper and asked one question. Why did you come? They all wrote their reasons. They were collected, and in one letter, which was sent out the next morning, why we went articulated the alliance between reformist Jews, African Americans in the South, and racial equality writ large. It's an incredible letter. And instead of going through piece by piece, right, paragraph by paragraph, what I identified were 5 terms that I think explain the answers to the question, why we went. Why did you go? Morality. Quote, we came to St. Augustine mainly because we could not stay away. We could not pass by the opportunity to achieve a moral goal by moral means. A moral goal by moral means, a rare modern privilege, which has been the glory of the nonviolent struggle for civil rights. So morality, solidarity with the oppressed. Atonement, an important concept in the Judeo-Christian belief system. Atonement. Quote, we could not stand quietly by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We have been vocal in our exhortation of others, but the idleness of our hands too often revealed an inner silence. Silence at a time when silence has become the unpardonable sin of our time. We came in the hope that God of all of us would accept our small involvement as a partial atonement for the many things we wish we had done before and often. Atonement. History. Reverend Prince, who spoke at the March on Washington, fled Nazi Germany in 1937. It's Holocaust Remembrance Day today in the Jewish faith. Quote, we came as Jews who remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoriums. We came because we know that, second only to silence, the greatest danger to man is a loss of faith in man's capacity to act. history. Faith. Faith. We believe in man's ability to fulfill God's commands with God's help. We make no messianic estimate of man's power, and certainly not of what we did here. Again, it's the white savior complex. It's not us. But it has reaffirmed our faith in the significance of the deed. So we must confess in all humility that we did this as much in fulfillment of our faith and in response to our inner need as in service to our black brothers. Faith. And one that I think is often missed by people for whom this history makes them uncomfortable, rightfully so. It's patriotism. We do not underestimate what yet needs to be done in the North as well as the South. In the battle against racism, we have participated here in only a skirmish. But the total effect of all such demonstrations has created a nonviolent revolution. The conscience of the nation has been aroused as never before. The Civil Rights Bill will become law, and much more progress will be attained because this national conscience has been touched in this and other places due to the struggle. The movement is one of the most patriotic topics we can teach in our schools because it reflects a faith in the nation to live up to its values equally to all people. That's patriotic education. That's not a mask for political indoctrination. Why don't we know more about the letter? The simple answer is because the next day the Senate voted and passed the Civil Rights Act, 73 to 27. It succeeded. One of the things, and I wrote it down, but the New York Times the next day, the headline was, on St. Augustine, 16 Jewish rabbis are arrested at demonstration in St. Augustine, Florida. It was not the Monson Motor Lodge. It was not the muriatic acid, and it was not the Civil Rights Act. The headline on the New York Times morning edition was 16 Jews arrested in St. Augustine. That was the story. Quickly changed. And you can see the next morning it is the Civil Rights Act passed. Dr. King was in St. Augustine when he received news that it had actually passed. Again, an 83-day long filibuster, the longest filibuster to this date in American history of any bill. The owner of the Monson Motor Lodge demonstrated his resistance to the act the next day by putting up the symbol of resistance to racial equality, the Confederate battle flag. So the legacy. The next day the rabbis left. But they left knowing that they had played an important role in history. More importantly, they left knowing that they had explained the reasons that they were motivated to provide solidarity and brotherhood to African Americans of St. Augustine. These three images sort of symbolize the major things, in my opinion. One, Rabbi Dresner and Dr. King. This is when Dr. King spoke at Rabbi Dresner's synagogue in New Jersey in 1963. It demonstrates, it reaffirms that interfaith alliance, particularly the alliance between the reformist Jewish tradition and the Southern Black Christian freedom struggle. Different rooms, same house. Demonstrates the national importance because on July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Local people make a national difference that resonates to this very day. But let's not fool ourselves. The passage of the law is the first step in change. The law gives us the mechanism through which to combat racial discrimination. It does not, in fact, bring equality. 2 days after the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, this was the scene in downtown St. Augustine. July 4, 1964, right down the road. Resistance. Don't look at the faces too long. to leave you with some things to think about. Some things that are relevant. Because that's what makes this history relevant. I mean, that's why it makes it important, because of its relevance. It's what gives it the legacy. It's what makes it true than William Faulkner's words that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. I want to give you a clip from the speech that Rabbi Prince gave at the March on Washington. Bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not for the sake of the black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Why, then, is silence a tragic problem? It's because history has been politicized by bad faith actors. And it's these stories which make some people uncomfortable, as they should, are inconvenient and labeled un-American and unpatriotic, when the opposite is actually the truth. We're seeing this happen on almost a daily basis, where an honest appraisal of our collective past is being targeted. It's being vilified as indoctrination. It's being silenced and underfunded intentionally. The thing in Florida is that, guys, this has been going on for a few years now. Florida today is the America of tomorrow. Or the America of today is the Florida of yesterday. We see that an honest presentation of African American history is labeled anti-American ideology as divisive. I've gotten emails from people that I've worked with at Florida Humanities who have sponsored programs like this, who said, we no longer can afford a speaker series. We have lost employees. 85% of the National Endowment for the Humanities, 85% of all funding was cut by DOGE. What is the remainder NEH money being used for? To rewrite history. To pay for a garden of heroes. Literal rewriting of history. We see, I got this today from a colleague, that the Whitney Plantation, one of the best places to go to understand the legacies of slavery in America, in Louisiana, 40 miles outside of New Orleans, lost 2 grants to operate and tell their story. And that story is fundamentally American. It's made us who we are, warts and all. It goes on and on. The standard is you have to teach the benefits of slavery as well as the dehumanizing aspect. Seriously. I've got a teacher, a former student, who's nodding her head. We've got Florida school districts that cancel history. That's anti-CRT. That was me. But I'm not the only one. Lying about the past is and always has been a tool of authoritarianism, because it validates current policy erroneously. Lying about the past has always been a tool of authoritarianism, because if you can lie about the past, you can justify the present. And by claiming something is anti-American does not make it so when the opposite is in fact the case. It's not time to be silent about these things. And that's one of the legacies that I get from studying these histories, right? It also matters to tell these stories when incidents of anti-Semitism, of racially based, ethnically based hate crimes are on the rise. This is Florida ADL numbers, and this is from 2018 to 2022. This image of the swastika and the cross is from Jacksonville. Here are the incidents of anti-Semitism, most of which, by the way, are not related to the Israel-Palestine debate, right? Don't fall for that okie doke. Don't fall for that. Florida, fourth in the nation in number of anti-Semitic incidents last year. Over the last decade, we see an 893% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. History may not repeat itself, but it most assuredly rhymes. You know, there is a history of what happened between the strong reformist Jewish African-American alliance since the 1970s. But what this demonstrates is what Dr. King said when he claimed we are all encompassed in the same old cloak of destiny. It matters because it does demonstrate progress, truth and honesty, how far we have to go, and it puts our convictions to the test in times like this. Do we tell stories that make us uncomfortable in hopes that we will fulfill our principles and obligations to each other as a nation, or do we remain silent? I know the answer to that question for me. Do you? Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. Everybody who stood up, you get paid. Yes, sir.
I'd like to say that I thoroughly enjoyed the lecture. My name is Erwin Brunson. I was one of the first 5 blacks to integrate the public school here in St. Augustine. As a 9-year-old, watching the civil rights movement unfold in St. Augustine was hard for me to comprehend. It would be similar to trying to understand our political environment without understanding there's a Constitution, there's a Congress, there's a Bill of Rights. I was in the dark. But thanks to my father, the Robersons, and leaders in the community, helped me gravitate what was happening, understanding why my father's car was bought, to understand why my neighbor's house was bought. And I've come to the perception that we all understood CRT back in the 60s. You've been able to walk into my ancestors' shoes and appreciate the opportunities that we have as a nation to grow rather than segregated communities. But the lecture is mirrored in my book, Life in Shades of Blue, especially the Munson incident and Dr. Haley, who's a very close mentor of mine, and I miss him dearly. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that. Any questions? Get Shelley.
So, discussing Dr. Haling and the violence that happened at the Klan rally, you mentioned his observing of the women in the crowd. I was wondering, have you done anything? I know the WKKK was more active in the 20s. Did you notice, anything with any of your research of them re-emerging in some sort of way during this time?
No, not. She's asking about formal organized women of the Ku Klux Klan in this area. No. It's the Klan, particularly in this area, particularly Ancient City Gun Club, very patriarchal. In other words, women have their role, men have their role, the men are protectors, the men are going to be the ones that are doing this in case anything goes down, and it does. There's not an organized female Klan unit that I'm aware of that operated in St. Augustine, because a lot of the formal Klansmen that had the robes, they came in from outside. Most of the quote-unquote Klansmen that are local, they were Catholic. That's why they joined the Ancient City Gun Club, right? They were not allowed to join the Klan because remember, it's an equal opportunity hate organization, right? They hate everybody who's not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So if you're Catholic or if you're Jewish, and oh, by the way, don't think that all people of the Jewish faith supported this movement. I actually wrote down his name, I probably won't give it. But a rabbi at a local synagogue went to the morning after the arrest to basically browbeat and tell the rabbis who were arrested to leave. You're doing more harm than good. You're an embarrassment to your faith. Right? So, good question, Shelby, but there's so much outside, inside influences going on that I have not seen, and it wouldn't stand to reason that there would be an organized female Klan unit like a WKKK that's here.
A lot more than gender agree.
Some don't.
Stick with history.
Some, oh, that's,
Stick with history.
yeah, well,
Our
sometimes.
history is gonna become reality.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't have to wear hoods anymore. When you've got groups like the Proud Boys and you've got paramilitary organizations that have the same intent, they don't have to operate under hoods.
You went.
I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
but
Ms. Jones.
yeah, so my question is, I had this big group that came in on Saturday, or whatever it was, yeah. But I got a lot of questions, mainly about the funding and all of that, and if it's gonna,
Yeah.
like, quiet what we do. But one of the questions when we got to the civil rights room was, why is it, and maybe you can address this in an academic way. Why is it that the story of St. Augustine did not make the national impression that Birmingham or Selma made?
That's the $1 million question. I think partially from in retrospect, that's what bothers me. It's because when Dr. King toward the end of his life, or even during the movement, would reflect on places that he's been, and it was always Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma and Atlanta, never St. Augustine. SELC saw St. Augustine as an embarrassment. And it wasn't an embarrassment for any other reason than they felt that they sold out local people. SELC, one of their go-to tactics is that anytime they came into a community, they had an exit strategy. And that exit strategy was always, we're going to form a biracial committee, and we're going to leave a legacy of interracial dialogue. Okay? So you see places like Birmingham, you see places like Montgomery, you see Atlanta, which becomes the city too busy to hate based on that model, right? What happened to the biracial committee here? It didn't exist. The people who were named resigned before they met. So the law is signed. What now? SELC left. And trust me, King and Andrew Young, they knew, Jose Williams, they knew that things got worse in St. Augustine after they left because, and y'all are not in agreement. How many people have you talked to, probably more than me, who said things got really bad after the Civil Rights Act passed in 265, right? And then the school integration. I've heard the stories about the fire bombings, right? So the only comment that Dr. King ever made about St. Augustine was that some communities had to bear the cross for others, and St. Augustine was one of those places. So I think that, number one, most scholars looked at Birmingham and they looked at legislation. They didn't look at the connection of St. Augustine and what's going on here in terms of helping that pass. And in retrospect, Andrew, his joke was, when I asked why wasn't St. Augustine mentioned by SCLC, he laughed and said, because we wanted to forget about it. They looked at it as a defeat because of the way that they felt that they abandoned local people. And I think there was a sense of embarrassment there, quite honestly. So that's my academic answer. The other thing is because of what happens with the media. The media doesn't stay and cover St. Augustine. They went to Mississippi because of Freedom Summer. So you've got incident after incident after incident. So what happens after Freedom Summer? You've got Selma, and you've got Jimmy Lee Jackson's death, and you've got that campaign and the Voting Rights Act. So while St. Augustine is still mired in this place of, wow, what's going on here locally? This is a community that has to come to grips with the legacies of the Civil Rights Act. Still coming to grips in some ways, quite honestly. While other campaigns are accelerating on a national level. All right? So, yeah, a fascinating question. That would be my answer.
Yeah, I guess I just ponder if because a lot of the people involved in some of those other cities remain in those cities because they're from there, you know, like John Lewis.
That's a great
And, you know, other people who were already embedded in those communities as opposed to St. Augustine where there was no real connection to the community other than it was a stepping ground to getting the passage of the civil rights.
That is a great point. And look what happens to Lincolnville after integration. And look what happens to Florida Memorial after integration. Look what happens to the black population in St. Augustine. It diminishes within 10 years tremendously. People leave, St. Thomas. People leave, they make their money, they become successful, and they don't come back because they don't have good memories from this period, right? So, yeah, that's the complexity of St. Augustine and how it kind of complexifies the way we look at the civil rights movement big picture. Yes, sir.
And wasn't it also viewed as not successful, actually? Didn't President Johnson come down here prior to the signing of this, the Voting Rights Act, and he insisted on an integrated audience because it was going to be segregated?
That was in '62 when he came down for the quadricentennial celebration. So that was actually before this. But again, the federal government, they did not want to get involved in St. Augustine because it was so potentially dangerous. So instead, they actually deferred to the governor to handle it. So, and that becomes a mess in and of itself. So yeah, it is a hand grenade for so many different groups, and it's local people that had to bear the cross for other communities. That's absolutely the truth. Yes, sir.
Bearing the cross is kind of the subject of my question. There's Dr. Hailing and the cross burning incident in September 1863. Was there ever any coordinated effort by Archbishop Hurley? So I see that look on your face. Was there some kind of response that he wanted to make, and was that response a result of the Great Cross of St. Augustine?
The church, the Catholic Church was actually called out for its silence, and Hurley also, with Presbyterian, right? Catholic. I know the Presbyterian Church was also called out for its complicity.
I've heard that King reached out to Hurley, and Hurley said,
"Oh, thank you."
But the cross was erected in 1966, so after the quadricentennial, after the civil rights signing, and I'm just wondering, I'm wondering if he used that as an indication to say Christianity, Catholicism. It was actually a multi-denominational cross that he put up, and I'm wondering if he was saying our cross is a lot stronger than your cross.
But in terms of symbolism for the Klan,
Right.
I don't know. Based on what I know about Hurley's response to King and SCLC during this time, I don't see that.
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's the cross that was put up in '66 by the church. Was that a rebuttal to, or like reclaiming the symbol from the Ku Klux Klan? Based on the inaction of the church and the diocese during that period, and I just don't. I would have to see primary sources that made that connection before I said, yes, this is what's going on. I just don't see that being the case.
That was a guess on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Why were the rabbis released from prison the next day?
Bonded out. They paid their bill. They didn't stay.
Did they ever have to come back?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge. I know that they came back later as part of the commemoration with 40th Accord, and that becomes a tradition.
Any legal issues? They weren't sued by the county.
No, not to my knowledge. That's a great question. But not to my knowledge, no. That was pretty much the end of it. Yes, ma'am.
So Hurricane Dora happens in
Yes.
64. The Beatles say they will not play September 11th, 64 in Jacksonville unless it's, everyone's allowed to go.
Yeah.
Do you think that, with them being a mouthpiece, push things forward more?
I think for young people, yes. Because the question is the Beatles being, when they came to Florida, demanding that they perform in front of the integrated audiences. I think it helps with the young generation. I mean, it reminds me of the Chuck Berry quote that my music did more to integrate this country than Brown versus Board.
Because
Right.
it's so close. I mean, you
It is,
and
but you gotta keep in mind, the kind of people that would join the Ancient City Gun Club look at the Beatles as homosexuals, as communists, as foreign invaders. So it's not like they're gonna say, wow, John Lennon doesn't like segregation? Let's rethink our priorities. So no, that would just reinforce this idea that we're
really
corrupt.
pushing the Jacksonville St. Augustine community and going, hey,
And well, that's the thing too. During this period, Jacksonville and St. Augustine are so totally divorced from each other. You would think that proximity, that there's a lot of similarities. Jacksonville is a different world, and St. Augustine is a different world. There is very little cooperation, and that's a longer answer about the nature of the movement in Florida, where there's little communication between cities because they have their local issues. But no, I would say big picture, pop culture, the next generation thinking about things differently, but in terms of influencing race relations in St. Augustine, then absolutely not. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, not so much about the history, but about what's going on now and about the ability to then teach this history, not just in colleges, but like when the government sent out the thing telling universities to start reporting students. Harvard was the only university that stood up and said they wouldn't. How is that going to affect like what you can teach, what other teachers can continue to teach without losing massive amounts of funding? And then the trickle-down effect, what's going to happen in our high schools when there's no longer like a true history taught anymore?
I think you're trying to get me fired with that question. I joke, it's a legitimate question. Look, there has been a long war on public education in this country that is just now coming to fruition. This has been part of the long game. This has been part of the long game for very conservative right-wing organizations that want to privatize education and don't like the idea of public schools anyway, because public schools are born because of Reconstruction and poor people and black people having access to formal education. So, long story of the long answer to that is, yeah, there's a concerted effort to ruin public education. There's no doubt about it. Some of that can be conspiratorial. It's like you want to keep a populace ignorant so that they don't ask these questions and hold power accountable. No, that's not. It's absolutely the truth. That is absolutely, Research Minds for Liberty, that is absolutely the truth. That's exactly what they're trying to do. From the Koch Foundation all the way through the Heritage Foundation, this is documented. This is not conspiracy theory. This is what they want to do. And they want to privatize education.
It's right.
They want to, yes they do. That is part and parcel of that reason. It absolutely is. That's not a political statement, that's a factual statement. Well, that's part of the rationale, and part of the reasons that public education is so bad is because it's so underfunded where the funds are most needed. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in colleges and universities, because we are private, I've never had to submit my syllabi like some of my colleagues at public schools. I've never had to ask permission to teach. There is a tradition of academic freedom here in that we are trusted as experts in our field to teach courses that we deem are educational, professional, and I've never had to ask permission to teach Florida civil rights. I've never been asked, what did you talk about at your lecture on campus? And look, it's easy to point out when things aren't good. And sometimes it's worth letting people know, whether it's Shelley Hazer or whether it is John Delaney, that you appreciate the willingness for Flagler College to sponsor events like this, because it's becoming less and less common, in all honesty, because of the power of the purse, right? And when you have federal funds that are tied to state funds, that are tied to curricular issues, colleges have to make hard decisions about what they are going to swallow and where, it basically, and I hate to say it, it makes colleges put a dollar sign on their priorities. So, and I saw, I'm sorry. I think I saw my student's hand first. I'm gonna play favorites. Circle back to the FBI, investigative. They are in St. Augustine because they are absolutely terrified and number one, J. Edgar Hoover is convinced that the civil rights movement is communist inspired, that they're taking directions, that Martin Luther King is a puppet of Moscow. Absolutely, yes. There is this fear in '63 after Birmingham, particularly after Birmingham, that this is part of a plot, a grand plot to destroy America. So, state offices are being told in the South, we want you to send field agents anytime there are demonstrations or rumors of demonstrations to document. And in Florida, one of the things that happens is that the Florida Bureau of the FBI actually sends agents to places like St. Petersburg, Orlando, Tampa, and they're reporting back literally, nothing happening here, black people are happy, we don't have to worry about it. Well, St. Augustine, that's not what they heard. That's not what they learned. So there are FBI agents who are being sent to St. Augustine to record and collect information, but remember, they are not they are not a law enforcement agency in terms of getting involved there. What the FBI does is basically collect all of their notes and they give it to local law enforcement to say, here's what we know. So, keep in mind, many of the FBI agents that are in the South monitoring civil rights activities are from where? The South. So the FBI is no ally to the movement. On the contrary, you have white Southerners who are acting on behalf of the federal government to give information to local law enforcement that they get from their activities. So, yeah, that's the big picture. The FBI does not continue their surveillance of St. Augustine in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act being passed. I mean, because that's kind of, they look at it as done and done, just like SCLC did. And so, so that's basically, Rachel, the role that the FBI played here. So, yeah. Are you clapping because the FBI left?
Can you go back to this? I can barely remember, but when this woman, your answer to this woman's question, you sort of went fast over something about who could belong to the KKK and who couldn't.
Yeah.
And some,
Yeah.
Can you say that more loudly?
Yes. The Ku Klux Klan had membership standards.
Of course.
Yes. You had to be white, you had to be Anglo-Saxon in origin, and you had to be Protestant. So if you are, you're out. You're out. If you're Catholic, if you're Jewish, if you're an immigrant, if you had a criminal record for crimes that they considered to be amoral.
And they were the ones that had to belong to the gun club or something.
No, they can't join the Klan, but they basically say, we like their get down, so we're going to do our own little Catholic Klan thing. And you don't have to be a Catholic to join us, you just have to hate black people. So, yeah, that's the, and you also had to take an oath as a Klansman, basically saying that you believe in white supremacy. The slogan of the second Klan in America, by the way, it's the slogan of the second Ku Klux Klan in the United States was America First. So they styled themselves as a patriotic organization. Bible, cross, flag. So yeah, there were, but there, this is because you can't make this stuff up, and if you try to understand white supremacy, you'll drive yourself crazy. there were some Klan units throughout the nation that had children's auxiliary units of the Klan, and they were called the Ku Klux Kitties. Okay. Yeah, yeah. It's like, anyway.
Could you expound on what is the, statues of, heroes, is it?
Yeah, there's gonna be, that's for the 250th, yes, there's gonna be a Garden of Heroes. Yes. And it's an interesting cast of characters. I think Anne Ryan is one of the.
I just got an email like late today, for invitation to write a grant for the Garden of Heroes. I didn't have a chance to look at it. You had that up there.
I would love to see Robert Haley.
I also got news today of NEH grants for archiving program that we've been working to do for a while at University of North Florida being canceled. So, it's like, for people who don't know, if you like history programs also, just in terms of not being silent, that the state of Florida tomorrow has a hearing about eliminating TDC funds. That committee is meeting again tomorrow in the Senate. They met in the House earlier this week. And using TDC funds, which are been taxes that furnish funds for a lot of activities that we love in the history and art community and culture community, that will be redirected for general funds for roads and police and all the other stuff, so that we can get budget cuts and eliminate property taxes, so that our economy.
It's happening in real time.
Something good for it, yes.
It's happening in real time. So,
Tourism state.
one last question I think we have time for, and I've seen your hand several times, I'm sorry.
Finally, I was wondering, have you perhaps written a book that would cover this era that you're talking about and cover a lot of this, or do you recommend a book that covers the quintessential information about this era so that people can really go back? Like, I lived through that period of time when I was a Northerner, living in New England. I knew Governor Peabody's wife, or his mother. It was really a very distant memory for me, remembering what was happening in the South. And since I've been here, I've had people like early who've informed me, because I used to see these films on TV and say to myself, God, what are they doing to these people? The children going to school, and I'm 15, 14 years old, and I'm saying to my grandparents, look what they're doing to these children, they just want to go to school. I was in an uproar over it, and they were telling me, don't discuss things in which you know nothing about. I'm saying, they're being tortured, that's what I know, and so this has never left my memory, because I didn't have to live through this era in the South. But since I've met people like Erwin, I've been here for the last 27 years, I've informed myself, and it's been amazing. And it makes me want to tell my granddaughter about these things, so she will grow up at the age of 12 knowing that these things are real and they can happen.
Yeah, there are some books that have been written about it in terms of a comprehensive overview of the entire story. No, not really. But there are bits and pieces in different works that speak to different parts of the story.
Would you have one in mind that you said this is really good?
Well, yeah, we have an author here.
Excuse me, Dr. Butler, I have written Shade in the Sunshine State, Reflections on Segregation in Florida. Wrote it to 2014, and it is a bunch of first-person stories about what it was like, the whole history of it, and it really changed my perspective about not just African-American, but Jewish-American people in Florida, what it was like.
Shade in the Sunshine.
Shade in the Sunshine State is my name.
I should speak with Erwin, who wrote My Life in Shades of Blue.
Okay,
Because I lived through it.
there's very complimentary material. I just want to tell you all, I speak in libraries. My name is Liz Corson. I have about 50 programs that I present about African American and Jewish American history as they pertain to Florida. And I have never seen so many angry audiences in the last couple of years. I've got people who are taking notes about my program. I have people who are trying to trip me up. I have people who are trying to make sure that my programs are not available in Florida libraries. And I've seen this all over, and it's never been so bad. I have people who are I think they're following me around. I'm not trying to be paranoid, but I really think there's a movement afoot to isolate people, identify and isolate people who are talking about these matters in public. And it is very apparent to me how this has all started, and it is continuing, and it's getting very bad.
It's like, it's been put to sleep, it was long ago, let's not bring it up again.
Well, it's
I think it's more hostile than that.
It's very hostile.
Where can I get your book?
Well.
I got one right there.